You see, this wasn't the interaction pattern of someone struggling to keep up. Struggling cadets grab offered lifelines with varying degrees of desperation or pride. They negotiate for advantages, plead for exceptions, or stubbornly refuse help in ways that reveal their insecurity. Cora's responses followed a different emotional arithmetic altogether. Her gratitude never dipped into desperation. Her refusals never sharpened into defensiveness. Every phrase felt calibrated to achieve specific diplomatic outcomes rather than expressing genuine feeling. Rogan recognized the patterns immediately. Centuran diplomatic training emphasizes reading the subtext of interstellar negotiations, where what isn't said often matters more than what is. Cora's politeness wasn't just manners, it was operational security. Her deflections weren't avoidant, they were strategic. The measured gratitude, the careful phrasing, the perfectly timed slight smile that never quite reached her eyes, it all pointed toward someone executing a predetermined communication protocol rather than engaging in spontaneous conversation. The resolution became increasingly clear with each politely evasive response. This human wasn't refusing help because of pride or ignorance. She was maintaining a consistent persona. The apparent incompetence in training exercises, the carefully measured underperformance, the strategic breathing patterns, all of it aligned with the diplomatic deflection happening right now. The politeness wasn't masking insecurity. It was masking capability, which suggests the entire struggling human performance might be intentional theater. Every awkward climb, every strained repetition, every show of exhaustion, all potentially calculated to present exactly the image the Academy expected to see. Rogan found himself wondering not whether humans were weaker than other species, but why they'd want everyone to think they were. The strategic implications of deliberately appearing incompetent while actually possessing hidden capabilities opened unsettling questions about Earth's actual intentions in joining the galactic community. The three-dimensional agility course hung in the training arena like a giant abstract sculpture, designed by someone who'd never encountered the concept of up and down. It consisted of floating platforms, rotating bars, and momentum transfer rings arranged in a configuration that defied conventional navigation. The course didn't just challenge physical ability, it challenged fundamental assumptions about how bodies should move through space. For species evolved in environments with complex vertical elements or variable gravity, it represented a stimulating exercise. For humans, it looked like a specialized torture device. Rogan Steele moved through the course with the economical grace of someone whose ancestors had evolved on a world with three competing gravitational fields. His forelegs provided stable launching platforms for jumps, his torso rotating independently to maintain orientation during complex maneuvers. He used the spinning rings not as obstacles but as acceleration tools, timing his movements to harness their rotational energy. His path through the course appeared almost preordained, each movement flowing into the next with minimal effort and maximum efficiency. The observers noted his performance with approving nods, their data pads registering optimal energy expenditure and perfect trajectory calculations. Cora's attempt looked like a physics demonstration gone horribly wrong. Her first jump to a floating platform landed her off balance, requiring several awkward adjustments to avoid tumbling into the safety nets. Where Rogan used the rotating bars as propulsion aids, Cora seemed to fight against their motion, her grip frequently mistimed as if the spinning objects actively resisted her presence. Her navigation between platforms involved hesitant jumps and last-minute corrections that wasted energy and momentum. The course's motion sensors registered unusual movement patterns, abrupt stops, unnecessary corrections, and frequent recalculations of trajectory. The clinical observers made notes with detached professionalism. Subject demonstrates significant spatial orientation challenges, one commented, her stylus tapping against the assessment form. Human locomotion appears optimized for planar movement patterns, another added, as if discovering something revolutionary rather than stating the obvious. They documented her inefficient energy transfer and suboptimal path selection, with the satisfaction of scientists confirming well-established hypotheses. Their evaluation software helpfully generated comparative diagrams showing how human movement patterns deviated from the ideal trajectories established by species with three-dimensional evolutionary backgrounds. You see, the assessment wasn't technically wrong, just remarkably incomplete. The course did expose humanity's terrestrial origins. Humans did evolve primarily for movement across relatively flat surfaces. Their vestibular systems weren't designed for complex multi-axis navigation. The observers correctly identified all the ways human physiology differed from species that evolved in environments where falling meant something other than rapid descent toward ground. They simply failed to consider that recognizing limitations might be the first step toward overcoming them. The evaluation measured specialization rather than adaptive capability. It documented what humans couldn't do naturally, rather than what they might achieve through training or technology. The Academy's framework treated evolutionary history as destiny. If your species developed in trees or caves or low-gravity environments, you received certain advantages. If your ancestors preferred open plains, you carried that limitation forever. The system had no category for species that looked at their biological constraints and decided to engineer around them. Humanity's evolutionary path became framed as permanent limitation rather than temporary circumstance. The observers saw struggling and interpreted it as fundamental incapability. They documented the awkward movements and concluded humans would always move awkwardly in three-dimensional space. This perspective ignored the entire history of human technological adaptation. The fact that they'd gone from ground-dwelling primates to spacefaring species in a geological eye blink. It disregarded what happens when a species decides their biological design parameters are suggestions rather than commandments. Which raises the question everyone seemed to be avoiding. If humans could transform themselves from planet-bound creatures to interstellar travelers through sheer determination, what made anyone think a simple agility course represented their actual capabilities? The struggle appeared genuine, but the context suggested otherwise. The pattern emerged with the subtle consistency of a well-maintained machine. Each test, each exercise, each evaluation, Cora's performance hovered precisely at that sweet spot between marginal competence and outright failure. Her climbing times consistently landed in the bottom 15%, without ever crossing into disqualification territory. Her strength assessments showed just enough force application to avoid being marked as non-functional, but never enough to suggest actual capability. Even her simulated combat scores reflected someone who understood theory, but lacked physical capacity to execute it properly. True incompetence would have shown more variation. Genuine struggle produces unpredictable results, moments of accidental brilliance amid spectacular failures, flashes of unexpected capability, followed by crushing limitations. Cora's performance showed none of that statistical noise. Her results formed a perfect flat line of mediocrity, across completely different types of challenges: the climbing wall, the strength apparatus, the reaction tests, the endurance trials, all returned the same consistent message. This human operates at the absolute minimum acceptable threshold. Rogan noticed the artificial quality of her errors. On the obstacle course, she'd misjudge a handhold placement, but recover with a carefully calculated stumble that looked spontaneous. During strength tests, she'd fail at exactly the prescribed number of repetitions, her form breaking down in ways that appeared natural, but followed predictable biomechanical failure patterns. The mistakes never repeated. Each failure was strategically unique, designed to prevent observers from recognizing the pattern beneath the chaos. She'd exhaust one muscle group on Monday, show respiratory limitations on Tuesday, demonstrate coordination issues on Wednesday. The variety of her shortcomings suggested comprehensive weakness, rather than focused deception. You see, inconsistent failure looks authentic. Consistent underperformance requires conscious control. When someone genuinely can't meet standards, their struggles manifest differently each time. A lucky success here, an unexpected collapse there. Cora's performance lacked that randomness. Her failures displayed the careful curation of someone who understood exactly how much effort was required to appear inadequate, without triggering concerns about complete incapability. The precision reminded Rogan of safety demonstrations where technicians deliberately create controlled failures to illustrate points. The resolution became increasingly apparent with each perfectly mediocre result. This wasn't about hiding strength, it was about controlling perception. Cora wasn't concealing her capabilities. She was actively constructing a specific image of human limitations. Her performance answered the question nobody had asked. What would it look like if humans were exactly as weak as the galaxy assumed? She provided that answer with clinical precision, giving the observers exactly the data their prejudices demanded. Which makes you wonder about the strategic rationale behind such meticulous deception. If you possess significant capability but choose to perform at minimal levels across all parameters, you're not just hiding your strengths, you're investing considerable effort in maintaining a specific narrative. The energy required to consistently underperform while avoiding detection often exceeds what would be needed to simply meet standards. This suggests the deception serves purposes beyond mere reputation management. The consistency of her performance indicated preparation, training, and discipline directed not toward excellence but toward the precise appearance of inadequacy. Rogan found himself recalculating all previous assessments. The breathing control, the polite deflections, the strategic errors, they formed a coherent pattern of deliberate misinformation. The Academy's evaluation systems, designed to detect deception, looked for signs someone was overperforming their capabilities. They had no algorithms for detecting systematic underperformance because nobody had considered why any species would deliberately present themselves as weaker than they actually were. The very concept fell outside their assessment parameters. What emerged wasn't the picture of a cadet struggling to meet standards, but of an operative executing a carefully designed performance protocol. Every awkward movement, every calculated failure, every show of limitation served a purpose beyond the immediate evaluation. The question shifted from, can humans meet galactic standards, to, why would humans want the galaxy to believe they can't? The assessment process at the Galactic Military Academy operated with the serene confidence of a system that already knew the answers before it asked the questions. The observers sat behind their gleaming consoles with professional detachment, their faces illuminated by screens displaying beautifully formatted data. They approached each evaluation with the clinical precision of surgeons performing routine procedures, checking boxes, noting deviations, recording metrics. Their job wasn't to discover capability, but to document how closely each cadet matched predetermined performance profiles. The system had established perfect alien norms decades ago, and every new evaluation simply confirmed how well reality aligned with expectations. When Cora struggled with the climbing wall, the observers noted suboptimal leverage utilization and inefficient grip placement. When she performed poorly on the strength apparatus, they documented significant muscular inefficiency and biomechanical limitations. The assessment forms had pre-written drop-down menus for these exact observations, allowing them to efficiently categorize human shortcomings without wasting time on original analysis. The data flowed into centralized systems that compared her performance against species averages, percentile rankings, and historical baselines. Every result placed her neatly in the marginally functional category. You see, they weren't measuring capability. They were measuring deviation from alien physiological norms. The Academy's evaluation framework treated Valdorian multi-jointed movement as the gold standard, Rogan's centaur-like stability as optimal biomechanics, and other species' unique adaptations as desirable traits. Human physiology became a collection of deficiencies to be documented rather than differences to be understood. The system could quantify how much weaker, slower, or less efficient humans appeared compared to aliens, but it possessed no methodology for identifying strengths that fell outside its predefined categories. Cora's performance gave the observers exactly what their frameworks expected to see. Her carefully calculated struggles, her strategic errors, her consistent underperformance, all of it aligned perfectly with the Academy's existing data on human limitations. The assessment algorithms detected no anomalies because they weren't programmed to look for deliberate underachievement. Their fraud detection system searched for cadets pretending to be better than they were, not cadets pretending to be worse. The possibility that someone might systematically underperform never triggered any alerts. This institutional blindness created a perfect feedback loop of confirmed expectations. The tests were designed around alien capabilities, which meant humans naturally performed poorly, which confirmed human limitations, which justified designing future tests around alien capabilities. The observers never considered that their evaluation methods might be fundamentally flawed. They simply assumed the data spoke for itself. Their clinical detachment prevented them from asking why human performance showed such mathematically perfect mediocrity across completely different skill sets. They documented the results without questioning the context. The resolution became increasingly apparent as assessment after assessment delivered identical conclusions. The process wasn't discovering truth, it was validating preconceptions. The Academy's systems measured how well cadets fit into existing categories, rather than what they might actually be capable of achieving. This self-fulfilling prophecy ensured that human capabilities would remain hidden behind layers of institutional assumptions and methodological blind spots, which created the ideal conditions for someone to completely dismantle everyone's understanding of what was possible. When your evaluation systems can't recognize capability because it doesn't match your expectations, you become vulnerable to dramatic revelations that rewrite all your assumptions simultaneously. The stage wasn't just set for a surprising demonstration, it was practically begging for one. Day 5's integrated teamwork exercise began with the kind of bureaucratic optimism that assumes all species play nicely together. The combat simulator had been configured to replicate a compromised research facility, a standard scenario designed to test multi-species coordination under pressure. Cadets received assignments matching their demonstrated specialties. Valdorians handled vertical infiltration, Rogan's unit secured perimeter control, and Cora found herself assigned to a solo monitoring station. The distribution seemed logical based on Wutianlai the Pingu Shuju, until a sudden medical alert triggered quarantine protocols for half the participants. What began as a routine exercise became an immediate staffing crisis. Cora's reassignment came through with automated efficiency. The system, following its contingency algorithms, assigned her to investigate a reported containment breach in Sector Gamma. The assignment sheet noted this would test individual initiative under reduced supervision conditions. Translation: they needed warm bodies to cover gaps in the roster, and the human represented the most expendable option. She accepted the task with the same neutral professionalism she'd shown all week, collecting her gear while the remaining cadets scrambled to adjust their team compositions. The simulator environment began degrading minutes into the exercise. First came the flickering holographic projectors, their stability fields wavering like heat haze. Emergency lighting activated with a low hum that did nothing to improve visibility. Then the atmospheric alarms triggered, a sharp, repetitive tone that even species without ears recognized as bad news. Display screens showed pressure differentials building across multiple sectors. The system attempted to compensate by activating standard containment protocols, which only made things worse. A new alert overrode the others: toxic gas detection in Sector Gamma. The chemical signature matched a volatile compound used in industrial processes, with an estimated 4-minute 30-second window until lethal concentration. The Academy's safety systems responded exactly as designed. Massive titanium blast doors slammed shut throughout the simulator, isolating sections to contain the threat. This represented textbook emergency procedure, developed over decades of perfecting training safety protocols. You see, the Academy's contingency planning assumed certain baseline response capabilities. The systems expected that any trapped cadets would have the strength to operate emergency releases, the technical knowledge to override safety locks, or at minimum the communication equipment to coordinate rescue efforts. The protocols didn't account for a scenario where the strongest cadets were quarantined, communication systems were failing, and the only available personnel happened to be the species everyone classified as physically inadequate. Standard emergency measures quickly proved disastrously mismatched to the actual crisis. The blast doors, designed to withstand plasma explosions, became impassable barriers. The ventilation systems intended to clear contaminants were themselves compromised. The communication networks meant to coordinate rescue efforts delivered conflicting instructions. Every system functioned exactly as engineered, yet collectively they created a situation where safety protocols were actively endangering lives. Rogan Steele found himself trapped behind one of the 12-inch titanium barriers when the holographic projectors in his section failed catastrophically. His emergency signaling device registered non-functional. The gas concentration indicators on his side of the door began climbing toward critical levels. 6 of the largest remaining cadets rushed to manually force the door open, their combined strength straining against hydraulic locks designed to resist planetary catastrophe levels of force. Their efforts produced no measurable movement, just the sound of groaning metal and frustrated exertions. The resolution became painfully clear as systems continued deteriorating. The Academy's perfect safety systems had created a perfect death trap. Their assumptions about response capabilities, strength thresholds, and emergency procedures all collapsed under the weight of unexpected variables, which created ideal conditions for someone to demonstrate why assumptions make poor foundations for survival strategies. The titanium blast doors descended with the finality of architectural certainty, their 12-inch thickness sealing off compromised sectors with a resonance that vibrated through the simulator floor. These weren't ordinary barriers. They represented the Academy's commitment to safety through overwhelming structural integrity. Each door consisted of layered titanium alloys, engineered to withstand plasma explosions, radiation bursts, and pressure differentials capable of crushing lesser materials. Their design specifications read like disaster preparation manuals, accounting for every conceivable catastrophe except one: the possibility that their own safety protocols might become the problem standard emergency procedure. Required 6 cadets to operate the manual override mechanism, a massive hydraulic lever system that theoretically could bypass the automated locks. The design assumed a combined strength threshold based on average physiological capabilities across multiple species. 6 cadets represented the mathematically calculated minimum force required to overcome the hydraulic pressure, maintaining the door seals. The system didn't consider scenarios where those 6 cadets might be unavailable, incapacitated, or simply not strong enough. The contingency planning stopped at the assumption that the required strength would always be present when needed. Rogan Steele found himself isolated behind one such barrier as environmental. Systems continued deteriorating. The toxic gas indicators on his side showed concentrations approaching critical levels. His communication equipment returned only static. His emergency beacon malfunctioned, and the manual release mechanism resisted all attempts at activation. 6 of the largest remaining cadets threw their combined weight against the override lever, their muscles straining against hydraulic pressures designed to resist catastrophic events. The lever didn't budge, not even a millimeter of movement to suggest their efforts were having any effect. The system was functioning exactly as engineered, which meant it was failing spectacularly at its actual purpose. You see, the Academy's safety philosophy suffered from a fundamental design flaw. It assumed capability would always match need. The blast doors could contain apocalyptic scenarios, but their emergency releases required specific physiological thresholds to operate. The contingency plans accounted for equipment failures, environmental hazards, and structural damage, but never considered that their rescue mechanisms might themselves become inaccessible due to strength requirements. The very systems meant to ensure safety became the obstacle to survival. The observers watched from their control booth with growing concern, their assessment protocols suddenly useless. They'd trained for countless emergency scenarios, but all involved cadets following established procedures with expected capabilities. This situation fell outside their response frameworks. The safety systems were working correctly, yet creating lethal conditions. Their data screen showed all systems functioning within design parameters, which made the unfolding disaster particularly troubling. The protocols offered no guidance for when doing everything right produced catastrophically wrong results. The resolution revealed itself with alarming clarity. The Academy's meticulous planning had created a system that could handle theoretical emergencies, but failed against actual crises. Their assumptions about strength availability, response coordination, and equipment reliability all collapsed under pressure. The titanium barrier stood as both physical obstacle and metaphor, an impenetrable monument to planning that didn't account for real-world variables, which created the perfect conditions for someone to demonstrate why rules exist to be broken. When systems become too rigid to adapt, when procedures become obstacles rather than solutions, when safety mechanisms become threats, that's when conventional thinking fails and unconventional solutions become necessary. The stage was set not just for rescue but for revelation. While the alien cadet strained against the manual override lever with increasingly desperate efforts, Cora approached the blast door with the focus of someone reading fine print. Her movements lost that carefully cultivated awkwardness, becoming economical and precise. Where others saw an impenetrable barrier, she examined the door's edge where the hydraulic system met the frame. Her fingers traced the seam between titanium plates, pausing at 3 specific points where the Metal showed slight discolorations from repeated stress cycles. The emergency protocols assumed certain operational parameters would always be met, that 6 cadets of sufficient strength would be available, that communication systems would function, that standard procedures would apply. None of those conditions existed in this particular crisis. The systems required resources that simply weren't present, which meant the rulebook had become useless. Cora's approach suggested she understood this fundamental truth better than anyone. When the assumptions behind safety systems fail, you stop following procedures and start solving actual problems. Her inspection revealed something the training manuals never mentioned: a secondary access panel, hidden behind a removable plate that blended seamlessly with the door's surface. The designers had included this mechanical override for maintenance scenarios where the primary systems failed, but they'd assumed only engineering crews would ever know about it. The Academy's training focused on standard operating procedures, not emergency workarounds that fell outside established protocols. You see, the door's hydraulic system contained pressure release valves at 3 critical stress points. These weren't part of the normal operation sequence. They existed for scenarios where maintenance crews needed to manually depressurize the mechanism for repairs. The access required specific tools and technical knowledge that cadets weren't supposed to possess. Cora's examination identified these points not through academic training, but through what appeared to be practical familiarity with mechanical systems. Her solution completely bypassed the established emergency protocols. Instead of trying to overcome the hydraulic pressure with brute force, she located the manual pressure release valves. These required simultaneous activation at 3 points with precise timing, something the 6-cadet team approach couldn't accomplish, even if they'd known about the alternative method. The system wasn't designed to be operated by a single person, which meant her approach fell outside every contingency the Academy had planned for. The resolution became increasingly clear as she positioned herself at the first release point. She wasn't following the rules, she was rewriting them in real time. While everyone else struggled within the system's constraints, she operated outside the framework entirely. This suggested her training came from somewhere that emphasized practical solutions over procedural adherence, where effectiveness mattered more than following established protocols. Which raises the obvious question: what kind of military training teaches cadets to bypass safety systems rather than operate them as intended? The Academy's methods focused on standardized responses to predictable scenarios. Cora's approach reflected a different philosophy altogether, one that assumed systems would fail, procedures would become obsolete, and sometimes you needed to find solutions that the designers never intended. Her actions suggested training that valued adaptability over conformity, that prepared operatives for situations where the rulebook would be worse than useless. The alien cadets watched with growing confusion as she worked methodically at the hidden access points. Their training had never covered mechanical overrides. They'd been taught to either follow procedures or call for technical support. Cora's confident manipulation of the door's internal mechanisms represented a completely different approach to problem solving, one that prioritized understanding systems over obeying instructions. This wasn't just about strength or technical knowledge. It was about a fundamental difference in how she approached challenges. The 12,000-pound titanium barrier stood as the Academy's proudest example of safety, through structural overkill. Standard protocols required 6 cadets to operate the manual override, a calculation based on average species strength thresholds and leverage capabilities. The system assumed certain physiological baselines would always be available during emergencies. It never considered scenarios where those assumptions might fail catastrophically. Cora approached the massive door not with the straining effort the situation seemed to demand, but with the focused attention of someone solving an interesting puzzle. While 6 alien cadets continued their futile efforts against the main override lever, she examined the hydraulic housing with methodical precision. Her fingers traced the mechanism's outer casing, pausing at 3 specific points where the metal showed subtle wear patterns from maintenance access. She positioned herself at the first stress point, adjusted her stance with casual efficiency, and applied pressure not against the door's massive weight but against the hydraulic locks themselves. The sound that followed wasn't the groan of straining metal but the sharp snap of precision components failing under targeted force. She repeated the process at the second and third points, each movement economical and perfectly timed. You see, This wasn't about raw strength overcoming immense weight. It was about understanding exactly where and how to apply force to defeat the system containing that weight. The hydraulic locks functioned like carefully arranged dominoes. Once you tipped the first, the others followed through mechanical inevitability. She wasn't lifting 12,000 pounds. She was convincing the mechanism that its job was finished. The observers in their control booth experienced the kind of professional disorientation that occurs when reality contradicts decades of established doctrine. Their screens showed the massive barrier rising smoothly, hydraulic pressure readings dropping to zero, safety systems disengaging in sequence. The 6 cadets who'd been straining against the override lever suddenly found themselves pushing against nothing, stumbling forward as resistance vanished. Rogan Steele emerged from the contaminated section with gas mask secured, his 4-legged stance stabilizing automatically as he took in the scene. The moment transformed human from liability to decisive force through simple mechanical reality. Where the Academy's system saw physiological limitations, Cora demonstrated practical capability. The assessment frameworks that had documented her weaknesses now seemed hopelessly inadequate, their carefully collected data suddenly irrelevant. The observers found themselves watching someone operate outside every parameter they'd established for human performance. This forced immediate recalibration of everything the Academy thought it knew about capability assessment. Their evaluation systems measured deviation from alien norms rather than actual potential. Their safety protocols assumed certain response thresholds would always be available. Their entire philosophical approach to interspecies integration rested on assumptions that suddenly appeared dangerously incomplete. The resolution revealed itself not as a singular act of strength but as a demonstration of strategic thinking. Cora hadn't overcome the door through brute force. She'd outmaneuvered it through understanding. This suggested capabilities that fell completely outside the Academy's measurement categories. Not just physical strength, but mechanical insight, strategic application of force, and the ability to identify solutions that conventional training overlooked, which makes everyone wonder what other capabilities might be hiding behind carefully maintained appearances. When someone demonstrates they can solve problems outside established frameworks, it forces reconsideration of all previous assessments. The galaxy's understanding of human potential didn't just shift. It underwent fundamental reconstruction in the space of 30 seconds. The medical team finished their bioscans on Rogan with the crisp efficiency of people who'd trained for exactly this kind of scenario. As they cleared the area, the lead observer approached Cora with an assessment tablet held like a shield. "Cadet Blackstone," he began, his voice retaining that clinical detachment despite the lingering emergency alarms. "Your performance deviated significantly from established protocols. We need to understand how you bypassed safety systems not covered in training manuals." Cora wiped hydraulic fluid from her hands with a rag, her movements economical and unremarkable. "The door's mechanical overrides are documented in maintenance manuals. Section 7.2, she stated, her tone matching his clinical precision. "But that's not what you're actually asking." She looked past him to where the other observers stood reviewing performance data, their faces illuminated by screens still showing her week-long evaluation results. "You want to know why my previous performance metrics don't align with what just happened?" The lead observer's stylus hovered over his tablet, ready to document explanations about adrenaline surges or emergency competence. Instead, Cora delivered information with the flat affect of someone reading atmospheric composition data. "My performance during integration week operated at approximately 10% capacity." She didn't smile, didn't boast, didn't even change her breathing pattern. "The warm-up exercises represented cool-down intensity by my training standards." The observer's tablet suddenly seemed heavier in their hands. Their carefully collected data, the climbing times, strength measurements, efficiency ratings, all required immediate mental recalibration. The decimal points they'd so confidently recorded now represented not human limitations, but deliberate performance parameters. Their assessment frameworks, designed to measure deviation from alien norms, completely failed to account for the possibility that someone might be systematically underperforming by 90%. You see, this wasn't about hidden strength suddenly revealing itself. This was about measurement systems encountering something they weren't designed to measure. The Academy's evaluation philosophy assumed everyone would try to perform at their maximum capacity. The concept of deliberate, consistent underperformance fell outside their operational parameters. Their forms had checkboxes for overachievement and underachievement, but nothing for strategic miscalibration. The lead observer's stylus remained motionless above his screen. He looked from his performance data to the titanium door now standing open, then back to the woman who'd apparently been treating their most challenging exercises as light stretching. His professional certainty underwent the kind of seismic shift that occurs when foundational assumptions prove incomplete. The galaxy's understanding of human potential didn't just adjust, it required complete reconstruction. Their measurement framework suddenly appeared hopelessly inadequate, like trying to survey ocean depths with a rain gauge. All their precise data, their beautiful metrics, their confidence in established evaluation methods, all of it collapsed under the weight of a single decimal point. 10%. The number hung in the air between them, transforming every previous assessment from scientific documentation to curated performance art. Which raises the inevitable question that began forming in every observer's mind simultaneously. If 10% capability could defeat safety systems designed to require 6 cadets, what would 100% actually look like? The Academy had been measuring what humans couldn't do rather than what they might achieve. Their entire framework required recalibration around this new understanding that human limitations might be matters of choice rather than biology. The observers stood with their assessment tablets hanging loosely at their sides, the screen still displaying performance metrics that suddenly seemed absurdly inadequate. Cora's explanation about operating at 10% capacity left them searching for some rational framework to contain this information. The lead observer finally managed to formulate the obvious question: what kind of training produces that level of controlled underperformance? Cora's answer came with the same clinical detachment she'd maintained all week. Earth Special Forces Gravity Division. She stated it as if mentioning a common administrative department rather than revealing a state secret. We train exclusively in 8 standard gravity environments. The number hung in the air between them, its implications slowly registering on the observers' faces. You see, this isn't just difficult training, it's biologically extreme. Human physiology evolved for 1 gravity. Pushing that system to operate consistently under 8 times that force represents more than mere conditioning. It's comprehensive biological recalibration. The Academy's medical specialists began mentally running calculations on cardiovascular strain, musculoskeletal adaptation, neurological compensation. Their expressions shifted from confusion to dawning comprehension of what that number truly meant. The selection process involves a 40% fatality rate within the first 6 months. This statistic isn't accidental. It's the intended filtering mechanism. The program doesn't just train soldiers. It identifies humans capable of surviving physiological transformation. Those who complete training develop adaptations that fall outside normal human parameters. Bone density increases that would be pathological in any other context. Cardiovascular efficiency that borders on redundant system design, neurological rewiring that allows conscious control of autonomic functions. The Academy's standard 3 gravity environment suddenly seemed like low-gravity training to someone conditioned to 8. Their most challenging strength apparatus settings represented her warm-up levels. Their obstacle courses, designed to test alien capabilities, became manageable exercises rather than ultimate challenges. This recalibration explained everything. The controlled breathing during exertion, the precise underperformance, even her ability to manipulate the blast door's mechanisms with such economy of motion. Earth hadn't just created one special forces unit, they'd established an entire selection system operating at physiological extremes the galaxy never considered possible. The Gravity Division represented humanity's methodical approach to overcoming biological limitations through ruthless Darwinian filtering, combined with advanced training protocols. Their graduates weren't just strong, they were physiologically reconfigured for environments that would incapacitate or kill most species. The resolution revealed a strategic depth nobody had anticipated. While the galaxy measured strength against alien norms, humanity had been quietly developing capabilities that operated on completely different scales. Their approach wasn't about matching other species' natural advantages. It was about creating entirely new categories of capability through extreme conditioning. This suggested preparation for scenarios far beyond standard military engagements. hinting at operational requirements that demanded unprecedented physiological performance, which makes the Academy's entire evaluation framework appear not just inadequate, but fundamentally misguided. They'd been measuring human performance against standards that were essentially recreational, compared to what Earth's special forces considered baseline conditioning. Their assumption that human physiology represented the lower limit of capability suddenly seemed like the kind of error that gets entire strategic assessments rewritten from first principles. The galaxy thought it understood human limitations, but it had only seen what humanity chose to show: a carefully constructed performance designed to conceal capabilities that redefined what was physically possible. The observers stood processing the implications of 8 gravity training when one of the medical technicians made the mistake of asking the obvious follow-up question. "Are there other specialized divisions?" The query hung in the air, with the awkwardness of someone realizing they'd just requested information they might not actually want to receive. Cora's response maintained that same factual tone she'd used all along. Titan Division handles ship-to-ship boarding operations. She paused just long enough for the observers to process that statement before adding the relevant detail. "They train at 15 standard gravities." The number landed with the subtlety of a docking collision. Where 8 gravities had seemed extreme, 15 entered the realm of biological reconfiguration. Ship-to-ship boarding typically involved magnetic boots and momentum management, not environments where simply standing upright would constitute a lethal challenge for most species. The follow-up information arrived without prompting. Deep core operations require 20 gravity minimum for entry. This number surpassed extreme and entered theoretical territory. Gas giant mining platforms, core sampling missions, operations where atmospheric pressure alone could crush conventional vessels. These represented environments the galaxy generally automated or avoided entirely. The idea that humans not only entered such environments but conducted military operations within them forced complete recalibration of risk assessment parameters. You see, Earth hadn't built one special forces unit. They'd established a layered system of increasingly extreme capability thresholds. Each division operated at physiological levels that alien medical experts would classify as immediately lethal. Their recruitment and training represented humanity's methodical approach to pushing biological limits through ruthless selection processes and comprehensive physiological adaptation. The galaxy's strength standards based on natural evolutionary advantages suddenly appeared almost quaint by comparison. This layered structure revealed strategic thinking on an entirely different scale. While alien militaries developed around species' natural capabilities, humanity had been systematically engineering capabilities that surpassed biological constraints. Their approach wasn't about matching other species, but about creating entirely new operational categories that fell outside existing galactic military doctrine. The Titan and Deep Core divisions suggested preparation for engagement scenarios that most species wouldn't even consider possible. The resolution transformed understanding of Earth's military potential. Their capability existed on a scale that made standard galactic measurement frameworks irrelevant. Where other species' strengths represented evolutionary gifts, humanity's represented deliberate achievement through extreme conditioning and selection. This distinction forced reconsideration of basic assumptions about power dynamics and threat assessment throughout the galactic community, which makes Earth's diplomatic posture appear increasingly strategic rather than weak. Their representatives' careful politeness, their apparent technological limitations, their willingness to accept subordinate positions in galactic organizations, all of it suggested calculated positioning rather than genuine disadvantage. When you possess capabilities that operate on completely different scales from everyone else, appearing non-threatening becomes a strategic advantage rather than a necessity. The observers found themselves facing not just new information, but a complete paradigm shift. Their assessment systems, their threat evaluation protocols, their entire understanding of interspecies relations, all required immediate reconsideration. The galaxy had been measuring human capability against standards that were essentially recreational, compared to what Earth's military structure actually represented. This suggested that diplomatic interactions needed similar recalibration, as apparent weakness might actually represent sophisticated strategic positioning rather than genuine limitation. The revelation about Earth's gravity-trained special forces didn't just surprise the observers. It forced immediate recalibration of everything they thought they understood about human diplomacy. Earth's representatives had spent decades positioning themselves as junior partners in galactic affairs, accepting unfavorable trade terms, conceding strategic oversight roles, even tolerating condescending treatment during negotiations. Their diplomatic posture suggested a species aware of its limitations, grateful for inclusion, and willing to operate within established power structures. This apparent fragility seemed completely illogical when contrasted with the reality of human physiological capabilities. A species that trains its military in 8 gravities doesn't need to accept subordinate positions. A civilization that maintains specialized divisions for 15 and 20 gravity operations could easily dominate standard negotiations through implied threat alone. The disconnect between capability and diplomacy appeared so vast that it could only be intentional. You see, this wasn't oversight. It was deliberate strategy operating on multiple levels. Underestimation became Earth's primary tactical advantage in political negotiations. While other species postured and maneuvered for position, human diplomats could operate with near-complete freedom from scrutiny. Their apparent weakness meant nobody considered them serious players, which meant nobody monitored their activities closely. They could observe negotiation dynamics, gather intelligence on other species' priorities, and identify leverage points without triggering defensive reactions. This approach allowed Earth to operate without triggering galactic security concerns that typically surround rising powers. Their representatives attended summit meetings perceived as technical advisors rather than strategic competitors. They joined research initiatives as junior participants rather than potential threats. Their ships received cursory inspections while vessels from more formidable species faced intense scrutiny. The entire galactic security apparatus essentially ignored humanity because their assessed capabilities didn't warrant attention. The strategic depth of this approach reflected sophisticated thinking about interstellar power dynamics. While other species measured strength through military displays and technological advantages, Earth recognized that true power often resides in controlling how others perceive you. Their representatives could move through diplomatic circles without triggering the automatic defenses that powerful species activate when encountering potential rivals. They became the neutral observers in conflicts, the acceptable mediators in disputes, the unthreatening partners in joint ventures. This positioning provided intelligence advantages that military strength couldn't match. While other species guarded their secrets from obvious competitors, they frequently overlooked the apparently harmless humans in their midst. Earth's analysts acquired technological samples, strategic assessments, and political intelligence that would have been impossible to obtain through conventional espionage. Their weakness became their greatest intelligence asset. The resolution transformed understanding of human strategy. Their apparent limitations weren't signs of backwardness. They were carefully cultivated advantages. The galaxy had been measuring human capability against standard power metrics, while Earth operated on completely different strategic principles. Their diplomatic approach reflected not inadequacy but sophistication, the understanding that sometimes the strongest position is the one nobody perceives as threatening, which makes Korra's sudden reveal not just a personal achievement, but a calculated political maneuver. The timing, the location, the specific demonstration, all served strategic purposes beyond mere capability display. This wasn't an accidental revelation of hidden strength, but a deliberate communication designed to reshape galactic perceptions on human terms. The performance delivered multiple messages simultaneously: that human capabilities far exceeded previous assessments, that their previous appearance of weakness was strategic choice rather than necessity, and that they controlled when and how the galaxy learned their true potential. This approach suggested Earth had been preparing for something much larger than simple integration into existing power structures. Their decades of strategic underestimation positioned them to make moves that other species wouldn't anticipate from a perceived minor power. The galaxy thought it was dealing with a species that needed protection and guidance, while Earth had been operating with the strategic patience of someone playing a much longer game. Commander Briggs summoned Korra, Blackstone, to his office with the weary formality of someone who'd rather be auditing supply logs than confronting paradigm shifts. The meeting invitation arrived through official channels with the subject line, "Administrative Follow-Up." and the time slot suggested this wasn't emergency response but bureaucratic process. His office maintained the standardized sterility preferred by career administrators, neutral-toned walls, precisely arranged furniture, lighting that eliminated shadows without providing warmth. He gestured toward the chair opposite his desk with a motion that managed to be both courteous and deeply tired. The conversation opened with the kind of procedural language the Academy used when acknowledging its own failures without actually admitting fault. "We're reviewing certain assessment protocols following recent events," Briggs began, his fingers tapping against a data tablet showing Cora's week-long performance metrics. The numbers suddenly looked absurd next to the incident report detailing the simulator door. "The Academy's measurement systems require certain recalibrations." He said this with the resigned tone of someone whose perfectly organized filing system had just been invaded by reality. You see, the institution now faced the administrative nightmare of obsolete frameworks. Their evaluation systems couldn't accommodate what they'd witnessed because they'd been designed to confirm assumptions rather than discover capabilities. The forms had drop-down menus for suboptimal performance and physiological limitations, but no categories for strategic underperformance or deliberate miscalibration. The training protocols assumed strength, thresholds that suddenly seemed laughably inadequate. Their safety systems operated on physiological assumptions that had been thoroughly dismantled in under 5 minutes. Briggs represented the institution grappling with its own irrelevance. His career had been built on enforcing standards that now appeared fundamentally misguided. He'd spent decades judging cadets against benchmarks that measured conformity to alien norms rather than actual capability. The meeting's paperwork lay between them like archaeological evidence of a civilization that hadn't realized it was already extinct. He wasn't threatening disciplinary action. He was requesting operational parameters for systems that needed complete redesign. The discussion moved through required administrative channels with ironic formality. Briggs asked questions about training methodologies, physiological baselines, and operational thresholds. Cora provided answers that sounded like they belonged in advanced physics textbooks, rather than cadet assessment forms. The contrast between the bureaucratic language and the extraordinary content created surreal moments, discussing 8 gravity training environments using the same terminology normally reserved for reviewing cafeteria menu changes. This wasn't about punishing, rule-breaking. It was about rebuilding systems from first principles. The structures that had judged humans needed to adapt to realities they'd never anticipated. Standardized testing protocols, safety regulations, training curricula, all required immediate revision to account for capabilities that fell outside previous understanding. The Academy's entire philosophical approach to interspecies integration demanded recalibration around new data points. The resolution settled with quiet inevitability. The galaxy's power structures weren't being challenged through military confrontation, but through administrative reconsideration. Forms needed rewriting. Manuals required updating, training protocols demanded overhaul. The most significant shift in interstellar relations in decades would begin not with treaty negotiations, but with revised assessment criteria and new safety standards. The bureaucracy would absorb the shock through its favorite mechanism, paperwork, which suggests that real change often happens not through dramatic confrontations, but through quiet adjustments to operational frameworks. When institutions face information that contradicts their core assumptions, they either adapt or become irrelevant. The Academy chose adaptation through the only language it truly understood: administrative process. The meeting concluded with scheduling follow-up consultations with Earth's military specialists, the calendar invitations carrying subject lines that suggested routine curriculum reviews rather than historic paradigm shifts. The galactic military establishment experienced the kind of recalculations that start quietly in tactical analysis departments and end with planetary defense budgets being rewritten. Standardized conditions, those beautifully documented environmental parameters and performance benchmarks that had governed interspecies training for decades, suddenly looked less like universal standards and more like local customs. Threat assessment algorithms that previously flagged certain species as strategic concerns now returned error messages when processing human capability data. The forms didn't have categories for what Earth's special forces represented. You see, the universe hadn't adjusted its difficulty settings to accommodate humanity. Humanity had adjusted itself to meet universal challenges on terms nobody else considered possible. While other species developed around their evolutionary advantages, humans treated their biological limitations as engineering problems. The galaxy's approach assumed certain physiological boundaries were fixed. Earth's approach asked how those boundaries could be systematically overcome through conditioning, technology, and ruthless selection processes. Diplomatic relationships underwent immediate recalibration. Trade negotiations that had favored alien partners required reassessment when human representatives stopped politely deferring and started citing technical specifications that others couldn't meet. Security agreements based on mutual defense suddenly looked different when one party's definition of minimum viable response involved environments others considered suicidally extreme. The polite fiction of human fragility dissolved into pragmatic recalculations of actual capability. Military strategies faced similar revisions. Battlefield simulations that assumed certain strength thresholds and environmental limitations suddenly produced absurd results when human parameters were adjusted to reflect reality. Tactical doctrines built around species-specific advantages now had to account for opponents who could operate in conditions previously considered inaccessible. The very concept of standard operating procedure required expansion to include capabilities that fell outside established frameworks. The resolution settled across strategic planning departments with quiet inevitability. Human adaptability wasn't just another data point. It represented a fundamental shift in how capability could be achieved. Their approach demonstrated that physiological limits weren't necessarily permanent, that evolutionary advantages could be engineered, that apparent weakness might conceal strategic positioning. This forced reconsideration of what might be possible for other species if they adopted similar approaches to overcoming their own limitations. The Academy's Integration Week suddenly became significantly more interesting. Where previously it had served as a predictable sorting mechanism that confirmed existing understandings of interspecies capabilities, it now represented a front line in rediscovering what might be possible. Cadets who'd once viewed the exercises as ritualized demonstrations of established hierarchies now watched human participants with renewed interest, wondering what other capabilities might be concealed behind carefully maintained appearances. The observers' clipboards, once filled with confident assessments, now carried question marks where certainties used to reside. This shift extended beyond military considerations into broader philosophical territory. The galaxy had operated on assumptions about fixed biological limitations and natural hierarchies. Human capability suggested a different model, one where boundaries existed to be tested, where disadvantages could become advantages through sufficient ingenuity, where strategic patience might outweigh immediate demonstrations of strength. The entire concept of galactic power dynamics required re-examination through this lens. The institutional response unfolded with bureaucratic inevitability. Committees formed to review assessment protocols. Working groups studied human training methodologies. Policy analysts produced reports on strategic implications. The machinery of galactic governance began processing the new reality through its standard mechanisms, which meant everything would change while appearing to stay exactly the same on the surface. Forms would be revised, procedures updated, standards recalibrated, all without ever admitting the fundamental assumptions had been wrong, which suggests the most significant changes often begin not with dramatic announcements but with quiet recalculations in back offices. The galaxy's understanding of capability, threat, and potential underwent silent revision as analysts adjusted their models to account for human adaptability. The Integration Week continued with its obstacle courses and strength tests, but nothing would ever be measured quite the same way again. The universe maintains its challenges without adjustment, but humanity perfected the art of meeting them through disciplined adaptation. Korra's journey demonstrates that apparent weakness often conceals strategic advantage born of foresight and preparation. The galaxy believed it was evaluating human limitations, only to learn it had been testing its own flawed assumptions all along. Those assumptions, built on alien standards and rigid metrics, crumbled when faced with a truth they never anticipated: that true strength lies not in meeting expectations, but in surpassing them quietly until the moment demands revelation. The Galactic Military Academy's Integration Week begins with a simple announcement. The universe doesn't adjust its difficulty settings based on your species' strengths. For Commander Cora Blackstone, standing barely 5'4" among 12-foot aliens, that means every test is engineered to highlight her weaknesses. But when Rogan Steele notices her breathing remains perfectly steady after brutal obstacles, you start wondering, is this human really struggling, or is she playing a deeper game? Commander Briggs stood before the new cadets with the weary posture of someone who'd given this exact speech 17 times before. His voice carried that particular bureaucratic flatness that suggested he'd long ago divorced himself from the actual meaning of his words. The Galactic Military Academy operates on universal standards, he announced, as if reading from a manual that had been photocopied into oblivion. We don't adjust for physiological differences. The universe won't adjust for you either. This cheerful welcome occurred in a hangar-sized orientation hall where the lighting seemed specifically designed to make everyone look slightly ill. Cora Blackstone stood at attention near the back, her 5'4" frame barely reaching the elbow joints of the Valdorians flanking her. The Valdorians themselves resembled elegant bipedal insects with their multi-jointed limbs and chitinous plating that clicked softly when they moved. To her left stood Rogan Steele, whose centaur-like build involved 4 powerful legs and a torso that would make a professional athlete reconsider their life choices. You could track the Academy's institutional bias just by watching where the instructor's eyes lingered. They'd glance approvingly at the species with natural armor or redundant organs. Then their gaze would slide over the human contingent with that particular blend of medical curiosity and professional disappointment, usually reserved for structural engineers inspecting termite damage. The alien cadets exchanged looks that ran the gamut from scientific interest to outright dismissal. One, particularly tall Valdorian, actually leaned down to peer at Cora as if examining an interesting but ultimately flawed specimen. You see, the Academy's foundational philosophy had fossilized into something rather telling. They'd started with the reasonable premise that space is dangerous, and somehow arrived at the conclusion that biological limitations were moral failings. If your species evolved on a high-gravity world, that showed foresight. If you developed natural weaponry, that demonstrated prudence. If you were human, apparently your ancestors should have tried harder. This created immediate and measurable pressure on Earth's representatives. Every piece of documentation they'd signed, every medical scan they'd undergone, every aptitude test they'd taken, all of it had been designed by systems that assumed human capabilities represented the lower boundary of acceptable performance. The assessment metrics literally had humans as the baseline, 1.0, against which other species enhancements were measured as multipliers. So when Cora stood there, looking exactly like what the forms said a human should look like, no claws, no extra limbs, no particularly impressive stature, the system already knew everything it needed to know. The observers made notes on their datapads with the serene confidence of people whose forms had checkboxes for exactly this situation. The stage wasn't just set for underestimation, it was professionally designed and rigorously tested for it, which made the fact that nobody noticed Cora's resting heart rate never exceeded 60 beats per minute particularly telling. The obstacle course unfolded across a terrain that looked like someone had taken the concept of fairness and run it through a particularly unimaginative committee. They called it universally compatible, which in practice meant every single apparatus had been designed for species with at least 3 limbs, redundant muscle groups, or some form of natural adhesion. The climbing wall stood 30 meters tall with handholds spaced for beings whose arms could extend to unnatural lengths. The crawl tubes had diameters calibrated for Rogan's centaur-like torso, not human proportions. Even the balance beams had widths that assumed either multiple contact points or prehensile tails. Cora approached the wall climb with what appeared to be methodical caution. Her hands tested each grip point with deliberate care, her feet seeking purchase in spots the Valdorians had simply skipped over entirely. Where the insectoid cadets scaled the surface in under 7 seconds using their multi-jointed limbs and natural gripping pads, Cora's progress looked like a technical demonstration of everything that could possibly go wrong with vertical ascension. She paused frequently, adjusted her grip, and occasionally descended slightly to find better footing. The chronometer ticked past 4 minutes while observers made notes on their datapads. Rogan Steele completed the course with what could only be called offensive elegance. His forelegs distributed weight so efficiently that the obstacle course might as well have been a gently sloping park pathway. When he reached the climbing wall, he didn't so much climb it as flow up its surface, a continuous motion that involved precisely calculated pushes and grabs that looked less like effort and more like choreography. He finished the entire course in under 2 minutes, then stood watching others with that calm Centurion patience that could feel either respectful or deeply judgmental depending on your own performance anxiety. The observer panel murmured into their recording devices. Subject demonstrates suboptimal leverage utilization, one noted clinically. Biomechanical efficiency rating, 0.68, another added, as if reducing human capability to a decimal point somehow captured its essence. They watched Cora's final struggle to reach the top platform, with the detached interest of scientists observing a particularly stubborn lab animal. When her time settled at 4 minutes 37 seconds, several made check marks on their assessment forms exactly where the training manual said marginal performance should be documented. You see, the course wasn't actually testing ability, it was validating assumptions. The designers had started with a list of species capabilities, found the common denominators, and built obstacles that required those specific traits. If your biology included unusual strengths, wonderful. If it didn't, the course would helpfully document exactly how and where you failed to meet galactic standards. The system produced beautifully precise data that confirmed every existing prejudice about physiological limitations. Cora's performance appeared to be a textbook case of human fragility. Her final stumble off the course left her breathing heavily, or so it seemed to everyone except Rogan Steele, whose Centurion hearing detected something peculiar about her respiratory patterns. While the observers noted signs of extreme exertion on their evaluation sheets, Rogan noted that the human's breathing, while audible, maintained a rhythmic consistency that didn't match someone pushed to their absolute limits. The pitch never wavered. The intervals between breaths remained constant. It sounded less like struggle and more like performance. Most cadets stumbled off the obstacle course with the kind of physiological distress that made medical observers reach for their emergency kits. The Valdorians exhibited rapid thoracic pumping as their multi-chambered lungs worked to process the thin atmosphere. Rogan's own species showed elevated skin temperatures visible as faint thermal patterns across their hides. Standard post-exertion biomarkers flashed across monitoring screens. Elevated heart rates, respiratory distress indicators, muscle fatigue signatures. The Academy's sensors dutifully recorded everything with the cheerful indifference of machines that don't understand embarrassment. Cora Blackstone emerged from the course looking exactly like someone who'd barely survived it. Her uniform showed strategic smudges of artificial grime. Her hair had that carefully disheveled appearance of someone who'd fought gravity and lost. She leaned against a support pillar with what appeared to be exhausted relief, her chest moving with audible breaths that suggested someone working hard to replenish oxygen. To the clinical observers, she presented a perfect case study in human limitations, a specimen pushed to its absolute operational boundaries. Rogan Steele's Centurion perception detected something else entirely. His species evolved hearing capable of distinguishing Siwei the Husi Bianhua that other races missed. Where the observers saw struggle, Rogan heard precision. Cora's breathing maintained a consistent 22 breath per minute rate with no variation despite the apparent physical distress. The inhalations lasted exactly 3.2 seconds each, exhalations 3.8. The sound never sharpened into the ragged gasps of genuine oxygen debt. The rhythm held like a metronome. This wasn't the breathing pattern of someone pushed to their limits. It was the pattern of someone maintaining exacting physiological control under the guise of exhaustion. Rogan recognized the technique from advanced meditative disciplines practiced by Centurion warrior monks, the ability to consciously manage autonomic functions during extreme duress. The observers missed it because their equipment looked for signs of failure, not signs of control. Their sensors were calibrated to detect when someone dropped below minimum thresholds, not when someone maintained perfect regulation while pretending to struggle. You see, the Academy's assessment philosophy created a peculiar blind spot. They'd built entire evaluation systems around detecting deficiency, which meant they excelled at finding what they expected to find. When Cora's biosigns indicated moderate exertion, the system categorized it as confirmation of human fragility. The possibility that a cadet might be deliberately maintaining those readings while operating far below their actual capacity never occurred to the assessment algorithms. The forms didn't have checkboxes for strategic underperformance. Rogan watched Cora wipe sweat from her forehead with a gesture that seemed almost theatrical in its timing. The movement coincided perfectly with the moment the medical scanners panned across her section, creating a brief occlusion that masked her true physiological state. Coincidence, perhaps, but Centurions don't believe in coincidences. They believe in probability calculations and observable evidence. The evidence suggested the human knew exactly when she was being monitored and how to present the expected data. The first crack in the narrative of human inadequacy appeared not as a dramatic reveal but as a quiet anomaly in breathing patterns. It was the kind of detail that gets overlooked in systems designed to confirm prejudices rather than discover truths, which made Rogan wonder what other capabilities might be hiding behind carefully performed displays of mediocrity. Day 2 brought the kind of equipment that looks impressively universal until you realize it was designed by a committee that defined universal as works perfectly for us and slightly worse for everyone else. The strength apparatus stood gleaming in the training arena like a temple to alien athleticism, a massive hydraulic resistance machine with adjustable grips, pressure sensors, and enough biofeedback displays to make a medical scanner feel inadequate. Instructor Korath demonstrated proper form with the serene confidence of someone whose species had literally evolved to operate such devices. His forearms moved through the prescribed motions with fluid precision, each muscle group activating in perfect sequence as the machine's displays lit up with optimal efficiency metrics. "Note the breathing pattern," he announced between effortless repetitions. "Full thoracic expansion on the negative motion. Controlled exhalation during exertion." The machine registered his performance as 98% efficiency, which for his species apparently represented an off day. Bex Mole approached the apparatus next, his low centroid body requiring a completely different stance. Where Korath had stood upright, Vex dropped into a squatting position that utilized his species' unique leverage capabilities. The machine's adaptive systems recalibrated instantly, recognizing his physiological signature and adjusting resistance curves to match his biomechanics. His performance registered 94% efficiency, despite looking nothing like Korath's technique. Then Quillen stepped up, her slender frame employing a rapid cycling approach that used momentum rather than raw strength, scoring 92% through what appeared to be a technical loophole in the machine's evaluation algorithms. Cora requested guidance with polite deference, asking specific questions about hand placement and breathing synchronization that suggested someone trying desperately to understand a fundamentally alien concept. She set the apparatus to its minimum resistance setting, a level the manual designated for rehabilitation cases and juvenile trainees. Her first repetition looked less like strength training and more like someone trying to push a stuck spacecraft hatch. The motion lacked fluidity, the biomechanical feedback showing inefficient transfer of force. The breathing pattern deliberately mismatched to the exertion cycle. She managed 3 full repetitions, and what could charitably be called half of a fourth before the machine automatically safetied itself, its sensors detecting muscular fatigue patterns that indicated imminent failure. The observers made clinical notes without looking up from their data pads. "Significant torque variance across rotational axis," one murmured. "Neuromuscular efficiency rating 0.57, another added, as if reducing human capacity to a decimal somehow captured its essence. Their assessment forms had pre-written comments. For this exact scenario, phrases like suboptimal force application and inadequate physiological adaptation that could be selected with a single tap. You see, the device wasn't universal. It measured adaptation to alien strength norms. The calibration setting started from physiological baselines established by the Academy's founding species, then applied compensation algorithms for everyone else. When Cora set it to minimum resistance, she wasn't accessing the machine's true lower limits. She was engaging a system designed to make weaker species feel included, while still measuring them against alien capabilities. The test didn't measure raw strength any more than a translation algorithm measures linguistic creativity. It measured how well you could perform someone else's idea of strength, which raises uncomfortable questions about what universal really means when the measuring sticks all come from one side of the galaxy. The apparatus could adjust its grips, recalibrate its resistance, and accommodate different stances, but its fundamental programming still assumed that proper strength looked like Korath's forearm technique or Vex's leverage-based approach. Human physiology didn't just score poorly. It fell outside the evaluation framework entirely, like trying to measure temperature with a ruler. The resolution wasn't that humans were weak. It was that the test measured conformity to alien movement patterns rather than actual capability. Cora's awkward performance demonstrated not physical limitation but strategic choice. She gave the machine exactly what it expected to see from a human, complete with the appropriate efficiency ratings and failure points. The observers got their beautiful data confirming human inferiority, while completely missing that the subject had manually set the parameters to guarantee that result. Rogan Steele approached Cora during the hydration break with the careful posture of someone trying not to startle a nervous animal. His offer of assistance came wrapped in the kind of diplomatic language that suggested he'd practiced it in front of a mirror. The Academy maintains modified training protocols for species with particular physiological constraints, he explained, his voice dropping to a considerate volume that wouldn't carry to the observers. I could speak to the conditioning staff about adjustments to your daily regimen. He listed potential modifications, reduced weight loads, alternative obstacle configurations, specialized breathing apparatus. Each suggestion was technically sound, clinically appropriate, and completely missed the point. Cora's response unfolded with the precision of a pre-rehearsed diplomatic exchange. She listened with attentive stillness, her head slightly tilted in the universal gesture of grateful consideration. When she spoke, her tone carried exactly the right blend of appreciation and gentle refusal. That's incredibly thoughtful of you, she said, her words measured to convey sincerity without enthusiasm. The Academy's standards should apply equally to everyone. She acknowledged each of his suggestions with specific counterpoints that sounded reasonable, but ultimately circled back to the same conclusion. No modifications necessary. The conversation developed a peculiar rhythm, Rogan offering practical solutions, Cora deflecting with appreciation. When he suggested adjusted grip enhancements for the climbing walls, she complimented his insight into human biomechanics while noting that standard equipment provides adequate challenge. When he mentioned supplemental oxygen for high-exertion drills, she thanked him for his concern about terrestrial lung capacity while observing that the current atmospheric mix seemed sufficient. Each refusal was packaged in such impeccable politeness that declining help sounded like accepting a compliment. Her final comment landed with deceptive lightness. I suspect I'm not quite what everyone expected when humans finally joined the Academy, she remarked, wiping condensation from her water container with a casualness that felt deliberately understated. The statement hung in the air between them, part confession, part challenge, entirely ambiguous. It could mean she recognized her own limitations, or it could mean she understood that the galaxy's expectations of humans were fundamentally miscalibrated.